Hi, and welcome to this presentation on resilience, personal grief, and self-care in social work. My name is Cindy Rowe, and I'm an MSW student at Marywood University. And in this presentation, we're going to look at resilience and the personal grief of social workers, as these both inform the need for self-care by social work practitioners, particularly for those who work with clients who are grieving various losses due to death. Stress and coping models for dealing with the adversity relating to the death of a loved one are based on the psychoanalytic framework of Freud, as well as his successor, Lindemann. In this perspective, grief is viewed as a major stressor that needs to be resolved in order to prevent the development of mental illness. Some coping strategies that can help a person adequately adapt to their loss are to accept the reality of the loss, find a sense of meaning, utilize the support that is available from family members and friends, invest personal energy into new activities, and recognizing the positive things in the grieving person's life that developed in the wake of their loved one's death. So by working through the tasks of grieving, as noted in Worden's task model, basically, this helps people experience positive growth after a loved one's death. And a couple examples of how we see this is those instances when parents establish some community activism causes, such as Mothers Against Drunk Driving and the Trevor Project. These initiatives, now that they're nationwide, they weren't always that way. They started by just small groups of parents who, through their grief, wanted to make a difference to stop the situations from occurring that caused their children to lose their lives. So they took the tragedy and turned it into something positive. In his studies on resilience and grief, Bonanno identified two types of coping, and these often reflect gender differences in how grief is expressed. Problem-focused coping involves attending to the different tasks that need to be addressed following someone's death. So partly relating to the fact that men have been socialized to define themselves based on their work, what they do, right? And to suppress their emotions, they have a greater tendency to remain stoic and hide their emotions and instead focus their attention on the things that need to be done in the aftermath of a loved one's death. So they keep busy. And this reflects a problem-focused coping style. On the other hand, because women are socialized to be nurturing and attend to relationships with other people and to express their emotions more freely, it's suggested that they tend to utilize an emotion-focused coping style. Importantly, however, is the need to remember that the experiences and expressions of grief are always highly personal, and that a person's gender does not fully dictate on its own which coping style they're going to adhere to. Work with clients who've experienced trauma from the death of their loved one can have harsh effects on social workers over time and can lead to chronic bereavement, compassion fatigue, and vicarious traumatization, and these can all lead to burnout. As we discussed in a previous presentation, chronic bereavement is basically a perpetual state of grief and occurs with multiple losses when the grief from a previous experience hasn't yet been resolved, with new grief from subsequent losses just being piled on top of that. Numerous studies cited by Hooyman and Kramer indicate that while many practitioners in the helping professions encounter situations on a regular basis that are emotionally wrenching for them, they feel inadequately prepared to deal with them. Specifically, research from 1999 found that a full 22% of hospice social workers entered that concentration with no prior training whatsoever on grief and bereavement, while an even earlier study from the 90s indicated that social work curriculums limited their course offerings on death and dying to electives, and that less than 25% of students ever took any of those types of classes. So these figures, along with the challenges inherent to the social work profession, especially the work settings where practitioners continually face trauma and death, these indicate that there's a strong need for the up-and-coming social workers to be better prepared for the work that they're about to take up. Some common challenges for those who go into types of work that involve a lot of death and grief include grief overload, which can occur from being repeatedly exposed to the losses of clients, like we just said, chronic bereavement. Countertransference is another issue that can be a challenge for those in this type of work. This can occur when the loss or trauma that a client is experiencing hits very close to home with the social worker who's trying to help them. In a similar vein, working with clients when the helpers themselves either trigger an issue that the client is really struggling with, or if that helper somehow reminds the client of their deceased loved one. These are also issues related to transference that are common challenges inherent in this type of work. Also, sometimes the grief of a client is just so deep and so far removed from the practitioner's own experience that they just can't relate to the client, or that grief is just too much for the worker to manage. And navigating the various ethical dilemmas that crop up in this work is yet another challenging aspect. All told, these challenges can leave the social worker feeling inadequate in their ability to help their clients. This can make the social worker aware of their own losses. So if the clinician's grief isn't adequately resolved, it's going to kick up and raise their awareness of the personal experiences they've had in the past. And this can help interfere with the helping relationship. And this, again, is another example of the countertransference that we just talked about. If their grief has been resolved, though, it can really help and inform the social worker's practice by enabling them to have greater empathy and understanding of what the client is going through. Social workers can also be inhibited by anticipated losses. This is when their fears get out of control. For everyone, for the most part, anticipatory fears, they exist in low levels, but they can become problematic for social workers if they interfere with that social worker's ability to be fully present with their client. The social worker's own death awareness can also block work with clients if they over-identify with the client's issues so much that they focus on their own needs, again, which goes back to countertransference. As in the social worker who becomes so preoccupied with their own mortality that they're unable to focus their attention on the client and the client's needs. Social workers should increase their own awareness of the losses they've experienced. This can help them identify their own coping style, what their limitations are, and they get a better idea of what it's like to experience a loved one's death from their client's perspective. Reflecting on a person's own losses can also raise their awareness of any unfinished business they're still hanging on to. And this is really important work to do before a social worker starts to work with clients. Because, again, in order to be effective in the helping relationship, you need to work through your own unresolved stuff first. As well as what we just discussed about reflecting on our own losses and knowing and respecting one's limitations, other helpful tips for working in the practice setting where death and grief are common. It's vital for the social worker to acknowledge, first and foremost, that they will experience feelings of grief at some point. Developing strong attachments to clients in work. This means that you will be upset and that your grieving may be more intense than you expect that it would be when those clients eventually die. You have to be aware that this will happen and you have to allow yourself to grieve. This is where compassionate detachment comes in. So compassionate detachment is basically balancing enough engagement with the client in order for you to develop that good, strong therapeutic alliance, yet remain detached enough to protect yourself from the trauma that's associated with what's going on with them and with their death. Seeking out help when you need it is another strategy for social workers to manage their own grief. Participating in support groups at work, seeking out supervision, and consulting with colleagues, these are all resources to help the social worker grieve. Lastly, practicing active grieving involves behavior that a social worker can incorporate into their practice, like we just talked about, seeking out supervision, consulting with colleagues, and the like. These are all meant to specifically address the social worker's own grief. So for example, this might include going to the funerals of deceased clients. Also, again, it's vital to allow yourself time and space to grieve. Although you have to keep in mind that the needs of the clients at all times supersede your own needs. So, professional use of self includes expressing your grief only when it's appropriate to do so. So there is going to be some instances where containing your grief is going to be necessary. Along with seeking out the help when you need it and being aware that you will feel emotions associated with grief, these are all things involved with active grieving. Self-care is a highly personalized practice. So what works for one person might not be helpful to somebody else. So, and we've heard this in class over and over and over again. It's vital that social workers develop their own self-care regimen. Self-care should address these 5 areas of wellness: physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual, and professional. So you've probably seen these suggestions on different things to use to manage your own self-care, right? But some ways to address your physical well-being might include eating a healthy diet, going to the doctor, getting regular checkups, making sure you get enough rest and exercise. Maintaining your psychological well-being might include seeking out individual therapy for yourself, engaging in fun hobbies that you enjoy, reading just for the sake of reading because it's fun, not reading academic stuff all the time, doing some meditation, and taking time off for vacations and recreation activities. Attending to your own emotional health. Things might include spending time with your friends and family, laughing and enjoying some humor, and allowing yourself to cry and grieve, and as well as finding other things that bring you some sense of comfort. Attending to your spiritual needs is yet another domain, and this can include, going to religious services, attending social functions at your church or in the community, engaging in self-reflection and doing journaling, and adopting a regular prayer and ritual practice based on your own spiritual beliefs. And lastly, in the professional realm, seeking out supervision and advice from colleagues, taking breaks throughout the day, and making sure that you eat lunch and eat a healthy lunch every day, creating a calm and cheerful workspace as much as you can control, and balancing your daily workload so you're not overwhelmed, and balancing the types of cases that you manage within your caseload so it isn't too heavy and high intensity clients, and participating in tasks that you find personally rewarding. These are all suggestions and some things that you can do within the workplace to manage your self-care in that respect. So this concludes this discussion on resilience, personal grief, and self-care relating to social work. And if you're interested in learning more about death and dying as they relate to social work, be sure to check out my YouTube channel, and the link is listed here. And thanks so much for watching.